since 1966.
This is NBC4's News Conference with Conan Nolan, Southern California's longest-running public affairs program.
On this edition of News Conference this week, the California Legislature will vote on the state's first ever rent control bill, capping rents at 5% per year plus inflation. Is it good news for those who have an apartment and bad news for those seeking one? And will government involvement dry up investment in new housing construction? We talk with State Assemblyman David Chu, the author of the rent control bill, and Daniel Yuckelson, Executive Director of the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles. The legislature is taking up dozens of bills regarding animal rights. This after already banning fur trapping in the state. Is outlawing the sale of fur next? We talk with the head of Social Compassion in Legislation, one of the groups that's demanding more humane treatment of animals. And after being excoriated by the LA City Controller's Office for a poor job in getting people off the street, we get a response from the head of LA's Homeless Outreach Program. We talk with Heidi Marston, Chief Program Officer for the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. Good morning and welcome to the Tom Brokaw News Center here at Universal City. I'm Conan Nolan. This next week, the California Legislature will take up a bill that, if passed, would result in California's first ever statewide rent control law. Backers say it will prevent gouging of tenants. Opponents say it will make the current housing crisis worse. Joining us from Sacramento is Assemblyman David Chu, Democrat of San Francisco and author of Assembly Bill 1482. Assemblyman, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
In a nutshell, what would this bill do and why is it needed?
California is in the most intense housing crisis in our state's history. We have millions of California renters that are one rent increase away from being evicted or becoming homeless. Our bill does two things. It creates a rent cap to address the most egregious rent gouging that we have been seeing in recent years. It also requires a landlord to provide a reason before they're evicted to prevent predatory evictions.
The state needs more housing. To build housing, you need private investors to put up the money for land acquisition, permits, environmental reviews, materials, and labor. Those investors need to know that they will get their money back with a profit. What do you say to those who argue that by government capping rents, there will be fewer building permits because of uncertainty from investors that they'll ever get a return on the hundreds of millions of dollars it now takes to build housing in this state?
So I can't agree more with the premise that we've got to build a lot more housing. The point of this bill is to stabilize some of the millions of Californians who otherwise would be pushed out onto the streets while we're trying to construct millions of units. We know about 3.5 million units is what our state needs to stabilize housing prices. We spoke very directly during this process with folks who are investing in housing as well as those who are building housing. And we included some elements of this bill to really address those concerns. Most notably, we exempt out any new building that's been built within the past 15 years. So in other words, if you build a new building today, the tenants in that building are not going to be protected under our statute for the next 15 years because we don't want to disincent investments in housing. I very much appreciate that the California Building Industry Association all but said that in their letter to us most recently about the current language in this bill. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that, and we also want to ensure some predictability to the housing investor market because we absolutely need to build as much housing as quickly as we can at all levels of affordability.
Dissuade us of the notion that this is a very good and important bill for those who already have an apartment, but bad for those seeking one.
If you don't own an apartment and you're a renter, this will provide some stability for you in that marketplace. But this bill also strikes a balance so that those who are renting to you, your landlords, can make a fair rate of return while ensuring that if you are able to get an apartment, you have some predictability on what your rent increases look like.
Assemblyman David Chu, Democrat of San Francisco, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
One of the groups opposed to this legislation is the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles with over 10,000 members. Daniel Yuckelson is the executive director. Thank you for coming.
Sure.
So the argument is that, listen, it's 5% of a rent hike on top of the consumer price index, on top of inflation. That seems reasonable. Why is it not?
Well, to those of us owners in the city of Los Angeles that are subject to 3 to 4% rent caps, some might think it sounds like gravy, but the real issue is we need to build our way out of the housing shortages we have here in the state of California, and this is going to provide a complete disincentive to that. Nobody in their right mind is going to deploy millions of dollars of capital to build multifamily housing when they're going to be subject to price controls after just a 15-year period.
Because they don't get their money out.
They won't get their fair return. And we're already seeing the bad effects of this in the state of Oregon. Building permits are down over 30%. Owners in the state of New York, with their over-regulation that was recently passed last month, owners have already said that they're not going to be doing the maintenance and the capital improvements to their buildings. They just cannot afford to be in business with this type of regulation.
We should point out that your members are mostly mom and pop. That people think of apartment owners, they think of individuals who are companies and have all sorts of properties.
Absolutely. These are people, our members are people that sacrificed for many years working a 9-to-5 job to save in order to invest in a rental property rather than investing in stocks and bonds on Wall Street. And many of our members depend on the money they get from the rental property to supplement their retirement.
You understand that there's a need for a solution here. I mean, there are people that are facing rent increases in a very demanding housing market, where rents in some neighborhoods, such as Boyle Heights, we've seen tremendous rent increases.
Well, we have to look at what got us to this point, and it's all this regulation that has created the housing shortages. We need incentives to build more housing in the state of California. This is the most costly state to build. A new unit costs around $700,000 to build. And about 25% of those costs go into entitlements, which our state and local governments get. And so that's the reason we have these problems. If you look at every city in California that has strict rent control laws, you'll see housing shortages, large price increases for rental housing, and you see a huge homelessness problem. Why can't anybody wake up in this state and see what's really causing the problem? It's overregulation. And there are better solutions out there.
Daniel Yuckelson, the Executive Director of the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it. Up next, California becomes the first state of the nation to ban fur trapping, and it's about to ban circus animals as well. Is a statewide ban on fur next? We talk with the head of social compassion in legislation, which has had a hand in dozens of pieces of legislation, many still to be considered this week by the California Legislature, when we return.